Hello and welcome to my nature diaries. If you've been watching some of my recent videos, you would have seen this setup of my third annual nature journal. While I'm working on this first layout, I thought I would share with you some of the things that I wish I knew before I started watercolor. This is a recap of the last hike we were on, and you can see how it all turned out.
Okay, so we are on a quick hike and we are looking for spring flowers. However, it's just starting to sprinkle. Anyway, I'm gonna just share what I find on the trail, but it's all gonna be really fast because we're trying to beat the storm. See you later. Well, we didn't make it as far as beating the rain. I did manage to find a few things. This trail was successful.
Even though we did get soaked, I did manage to capture a few images and pictures of some plants that I wanted to nature journal. And that brings me to my first thing I wish I knew about watercolor is that it's basically easy. I'm not saying that there isn't a learning curve to watercolor. We all know that there's a learning curve to everything that we learn in life. However, what I'm saying is that it's not that difficult to get started. After all, it's really just water and paint and a brush. If you stay with me to the end of the video, I'm going to share with you the one watercolor technique that helped me get past this fear or thinking that there was some fear connected with watercolor. The next thing I wish I knew about watercolor is that it doesn't have to be serious. In other words, you can play with watercolor. Whenever I would study or look at professional watercolor artists, I would become so intimidated thinking I could never watercolor like that. And after studying a few of them, I realized that they were using unconventional techniques. In other words, they were having a play at their watercolor. When we think about it, even children aren't afraid to use those little inexpensive watercolor kits. I wish I would have known how fun working with watercolors really are. The next thing I wish I would have known about watercolor is that it is forgiving. Because I was an acrylic artist, I was able to correct or paint over other mistakes that I made. So when I was looking at watercolor, I was thinking, oh, if I mess up anything, I ruined my whole painting. Just like what I'm doing here, I'm adding a lot of water and paint to this painting. But you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to throw a little bit of this kosher salt on there, and now I'm creating a texture. Those are the kind of things I really never did with acrylic painting. I didn't realize that you could lift color off of a painting as well. That was revolutionary to me. Even though it does depend on what kind of watercolor paper you're using and whether you're using staining watercolors, you can lift most of the paint off of your paintings to at least a certain degree. Even though watercolors have their disadvantages, I wish I would have known earlier how forgiving and flexible watercolor painting really can be. I'd love to hear what you think about watercolor this way. I wish I would have known how much watercolor has allowed me to become a better artist. One of the reasons for this is that watercolor has allowed me to paint more often. With acrylic painting, I was mostly working on larger canvases. And to be honest, if you're not going to do something with all the canvases, they do take up a lot of space. So I was very hesitant about wanting to paint because I didn't want to have all these canvases laying around. I also felt the need to be able to practice my drawing skills. So painting in a sketchbook like this and just making these small paintings or compositions, layouts, they really have helped me to grow as an artist because I'm basically making more art. I wish I would have known that watercolor, even though it can be intimidating, just wasn't as difficult as what other people kind of made it out to be. Even though I have lots still to learn, I am enjoying it, and I'm enjoying the pieces that I'm making as well. Instead of being intimidated by watercolor, I wish I would have known how much watercolor has really helped me improve not only in itself, but also in other art mediums as well. My biggest regret is that I didn't start watercolor sooner. I wish I would have known how watercolors helped me to start nature journaling. This is something that I have wanted to do for a really long time. One of the reasons I waited so long to nature journal was because I was intimidated again by watercolor. One of the ways I got past this was by experimenting with watercolors in my bullet journal. The paper was really thin and cheap, but when I realized that it looked decent on that kind of paper, I knew I could watercolor in a watercolor journal. Because of watercolor, I have lots of journals. I wish I would have known how well watercolor pairs with ink. I have had a fascination with fountain pens for a very long time. I had one years and years and years ago when I was young, and I didn't really know what to do with it or how to maintain it or take care of it. When I decided to get back into drawing, I wanted to invest in some really good drawing pens. Fountain pens are really economical, and you don't have to throw them away after they are empty. Because I started this journey with ink pens, I didn't even realize how much watercolors work so well together with them. Working on my drawing skills has been an important priority or goal for me because of nature journaling itself. Working on my drawing skills, especially with ink, has been a way to improve my art overall. It's also essential for nature journaling because we're trying to accurately represent a plant or flower that we find. Also, a drawing, once we start to feel comfortable with how we draw, is going to also set us up for an easy way to use watercolors. It's very foundational for our watercolor painting. I'm not saying that you have to learn how to draw in order to be able to watercolor paint. It's just this particular style works super well for me. You can paint in a much looser style with watercolor and still use ink as well with that. That's the versatility of watercolor, is that it can be used in so many ways and so many different styles. I think that was probably one of the reasons I was so intimidated to get started with watercoloring myself, because I didn't think that there were so many different styles that we could choose from. Another thing I wish I would have known is how much inking and watercolor were really a perfect marriage of my love of drawing, writing, and painting. And number 7 of what I wish I knew about watercolor was that this particular technique was a great place for me to start. Using this technique is what finally broke the fear and got me started with my nature journal in this case, and that is the wet on dry technique. Basically, this is just wet paint on dry paper. Once I realized how simple this whole technique is, where you're just taking paint and putting it on paper, I knew I could make this work for me. Once I started painting, I stopped worrying about things like water control with my brushes. I realized that I was going to pick it up eventually. I just had to get in there and get some paint on paper. I wish I had known about this wet on dry technique earlier because it's so simple. With this technique, you're just taking a drawing or an outline of something, whether it's something you draw or maybe you trace, and then you're just going to paint in between the lines. Really the same concept as coloring in a coloring book with crayons. Yes, there's a lot more you can learn with it, but the main thing again was that I was able to get started, and I wish I would have known how easy it was to learn these things once I got that paint on the paper. One of the things I just love and enjoy about watercolor so much is the way it just melts into each other. It blends and creates new colors. It really is a very unique medium to work with. After I got started with the wet on dry technique, it wasn't too long before I was able to work wet into wet and create interesting backgrounds as well in my nature journals. Yes, when I first started using watercolors, I put a lot of color down, too much color. I put too much water down at times, but it really didn't matter because the main thing was that I was learning and I was painting. I knew I was going to love watercolors when I completed my very first layout in my first nature diary. It's one of my very first videos, but I was so excited that I actually got started and I loved what I made. A quick tip for practicing this wet on dry is to write some letters like you can see I have on this layout. You can also use stencils and create those letters if it's something you don't feel comfortable doing, and practice painting inside of them. I think you're going to love this exercise, and it's going to be great practice for you as well. If anything has been helpful or inspiring, I'd love for you to leave a like and then also comment and let me know about your thoughts on watercolor. Also subscribe and share the video. That is a huge help. Follow me over on Instagram at my_nature diaries for more nature art. I hope this video helps in some way to get rid of that intimidation factor when we look at somebody else's art and think to ourselves that we can't do it. I'm hoping that sharing my thoughts about what kept me from watercolor will help you to get past that hurdle and get started if you haven't already. And as always, I hope you remember that you are amazing and creative. And until we meet in the next video, have a wonderful day. Till next time, bye.